It should be obvious from my channel output that horror is my favorite genre. I love being scared, I like stories that are on the darker side, and I like the freedom that writing horror gives you. But one thing that I don't think horror gets enough credit for is its ability to tell truly amazing stories better than other genres. A lot of my favorite video game stories are from horror games, and the genre continues to produce some amazing work. Signalis is the most recent triumph of the indie game horror community, a labor of love created primarily by two people, and it might just be one of the greatest horror games ever made. That may sound like a bold claim, but I truly believe it. Signalis is a complex game filled with incredible survival horror gameplay, unreliable narrators, and a story that constantly contradicts itself, yet also features one of the most beautifully tragic narratives I've ever seen. In this video, I'm going to be thoroughly exploring the world of Signalis, talking about its gameplay and art inspirations, and giving you my full breakdown on both the story and the timeline of events. Signalis is one of those games that's best experienced with as little knowledge as possible. If you haven't played it for yourself, then I highly recommend doing so before watching this video. You have been warned. I don't think I've played a game with a better cold opening than Signalis. The game begins in a very typical sci-fi manner. Our protagonist wakes up from a pod in a spaceship named the Penrose. With no meaningful information or explanation for how she got here, you explore the ship and eventually come across the flight deck. Instead of inky black, the window depicts a snowy landscape. Whatever the purpose of this ship was, it seems to have failed long ago, and now lies stranded in the middle of nowhere. While the logs mention another passenger, there's no sign of anyone else on the ship, so you continue to search. After solving a puzzle and opening the airlock, you find yourself wandering the seemingly desolate planet. Now that you get a better look at it, you can see there are signs that something was once here. Large black monoliths sticking out of the ground, leading to a central point. Pressing forward, you eventually come across a hole, unnaturally drilled into the rock, with steps that lead down. At the bottom, the ground and walls are a deep red, and with no other landmarks to guide you, your only option is to investigate a large hole in the wall. The game asks you to crawl through it. Once you pass through the tunnel, you find yourself somewhere very unusual. An office complete with books, radio equipment, a flag, and other bits and pieces. What's more, the entrance you came from has disappeared. A familiar book lies on the desk. A so-called ancient tome, The King in Yellow. Once you pick it up, the radio bursts to life and begins emitting a set of numbers and a warning. The game begins to fall apart. Fast cuts show people and events we haven't seen. An extract from H.P. Lovecraft's The Festival is ominously displayed on a pure red background, and our protagonist's face begins to peel away, revealing the metal parts beneath. A single line hangs on the screen for multiple seconds. Remember our promise. Then, the game begins. This opening does everything it needs to do and more. It establishes that this is a science fiction story, but then subverts it with The Office to show that it's not quite as simple as that. The gameplay immediately tells you that this is a survival horror game, as it gives you little indication of which way to go or what is going on beyond a few notes, and it has you solve a basic puzzle to learn how to interact with objects. This is all within the first 15 minutes, and while it's very light on story, it's a fantastic setup for the mystery that follows. The overall style of the game can be summed up as cassette futurism, a future where humanity is so advanced that they've explored and colonized multiple planets, yet still use technology from the 1980s, such as floppy disks. Think of the Nostromo from Alien, with its command line interface in 2122, or Shinji's literal cassette tape from Evangelion in the year 2015. Sometimes this style exists because of some in-world justification, and other times it's just because that's what people of the era thought the future would be like. The world of Signalis is a bleak depiction of an Eastern Bloc-style nation in space called Yusan, filled with questionable work practices and propaganda. While they still have CRT TVs and cassette tapes, the Yusan regime has managed to create a series of robots called replicas, each with different characteristics and uses. Most of the NPCs you meet throughout the game are various replicas, called only by their product name: Star, Yule, Stork, and many others. Elster herself is also a replica. The reason for the nation's reliance on old technology is explained late into the game, but it also fits the aesthetic from a design point. Yusan is a cross between a number of real-world cultures, but seems to be primarily based on East Germany, due to German being the most commonly seen language throughout the game. The character names, on the other hand, have a distinctly Asian style, and Chinese, Japanese, and Korean all appear at different points throughout the game on signage. Most of the game's world building is told through old documents and occasional dialogue from NPCs, but it's clear that by the time we take control of Ulster, something has gone terribly wrong for the people of Yusan. This game is capital S survival horror. That means you've got very limited resources, inventory space, and a relatively frail health bar. While exploring the first area, a facility named Sierpinski, Ulster runs into her first enemy, the shambling corpse of a Yule unit that suddenly stands up and attacks her. Their erratic movement and glitchy appearance, combined with a horrific scream, makes them a perfect survival horror enemy. They're slow, sure, but unlike other survival horror enemies that are relatively easy to run around, they deal damage by simply touching Ulster. Thankfully, it's relatively easy to keep them at a distance and take them out with a few well-timed bullets, but even that's not enough. Once you knock them down, you have to stomp on their bodies or shoot them again to make sure they stay down. After a while of running back and forth solving puzzles, you'll eventually return to a room you've already cleared, only to find the enemies getting right back up and coming for you yet again. The only way to prevent them from getting back up is by using the rare flares scattered throughout the game, which burn the bodies until they're unable to get back up. To put it in the most reductive way possible, the enemies in Signalis combine the features of a few different survival horror enemies. The stomp and general design of the enemies seem like a send-up to Silent Hill, and the flare mechanic is obviously very reminiscent of the Crimson Heads from the Resident Evil remake. Much like Remake, this mechanic adds an extra layer to your resource management. If you kill an enemy only for them to get back up, you'll just be wasting ammo, but since the flares are so limited, you're most likely only going to use them on enemies in very specific locations, like tight hallways that you visit often, or outside of major puzzles or save rooms. The enemy encounters combine a lot of the greatest aspects of different survival horror games to create very satisfying gameplay. You'll probably notice the more familiar you get with the game that each enemy seems to take a different amount of bullets to take out. Sometimes they go down in 1 or 2 pistol shots, other times 4 or 5. This variable health means that completely solving the game's combat is impossible. If you load up your shotgun with 5 shells, you can't be guaranteed that you'll be able to kill 5 enemies with it. You can get a decent estimate, but you'll never 100% know how each combat encounter is going to go, especially when you factor in the seemingly random chance of enemies getting back up. Almost every mechanic in Signalis has an in-world explanation, and nowhere is that better exemplified than with the game's unique mechanic, the radio. In survival horror, we are all accustomed to finding passwords and codes scribbled on notes or walls, and while this is fine when you're investigating an abandoned apartment building, it wouldn't make sense for a surveillance state as strict on security as Yusan to just have all of their secrets lying around in the open. Their in-universe solution for this was to change passwords frequently, and distribute them through secret frequencies that only a few people have access to. Mechanically, this means that once Ulster gets her radio, she has to find different frequencies that'll allow her to open whatever doors or safe she needs to unlock. This is the perfect marriage of gameplay and story, a mechanic that's unique and fun to use that doesn't feel contrived. I loved seeing how many different ways the game used the radio, and it makes sense that a lot of the game's biggest secrets are hidden behind it. Even your inventory has an in-universe explanation. Ulster only has 6 inventory slots, which is laughably low when you consider how many items you find throughout the game. Oftentimes you'll enter a room with 4 items sitting there, and if you've got a healing item, plus a single weapon with no spare ammo, and a puzzle item, most likely you can't even pick them up. And that's just one room. The in-game explanation for this comes from a propaganda poster in the beginning of the game, which reads, "Remember the rule of 6. Never carry more than 6 items on your person. Private property is a privilege." From a mechanical point of view, the tiny inventory encourages you to play the game in a very specific way. Carry as few items as possible, and use them when you get them. Most of the time, I couldn't even afford to carry spare rounds for my gun, so I would reload at the item box and only use my gun sparingly. Another thing I found myself doing was leaving all my healing items in the box, and if I got hurt while traversing the level, I just had to hope that I would come across one naturally that I could use immediately, which meant I could also pick them up without taking up a slot. All of Signalis' gameplay is well thought out, both in the context of the world you're exploring, but also in the genre it exists in. It has a very clear love for survival horror, and it manages to offer a fresh take on a very nostalgic style. The more time I spend away from Signalis, the more my appreciation for it seems to grow. When I first beat it and got the promise ending, I was very happy with it. I thought it was a fantastic game. Then I went back and got some more endings, and every room seemed to be brimming with new significance. I caught more details, found conversations that I missed the first time through, and by the time I saw the credits roll again, I fell more in love with it. The world building in this game is phenomenal. The way they portray the Yusan regime at war with the Shadowy Empire, the different replicas and their built-in flaws, and the totalitarian hellscape that these people lived through. All of it is extremely intriguing, but when I think of Signalis, all I can think of is the tragedy of Ariane and Elster, and how every single character was predestined to fail. In the very beginning of the game, Elster wakes up on the Penrose and finds a photograph on the flight deck. The description reads, "Despite the damage, Ariane Young can still be seen on it." Later, after picking up the King in Yellow and finding herself on Sierpinski, Elster still has a photograph in her inventory. If you aren't paying too much attention, you might not even notice that the picture has changed, along with the description. Despite the damage, Alina So can still be seen on it. This discrepancy becomes even more obvious when you discover a number of diaries scattered throughout the world written by Alina, as she descends further into the mine. Her diaries mention Elster, and wonders what happened to her, but the question remains, which Elster are we playing as? Is the Elster from the opening the same Elster on Sierpinski, but with a different photograph, looking for a different woman? As Elster travels further, things start making less and less sense. She enters frequent first-person segments where she lives out a scene from a completely different person's life, and comes back from them with tangible items. Areas begin to reappear, now corrupted by masses of red flesh, and the few sentient characters left continue to degenerate. We're slowly drip-fed information about the replicas, how they work, and where they come from. As the name suggests, they're robots created for various tasks. Some were created for dangerous labor, others as soldiers and scouts, but some serve an even greater function. All of the replicas in Sierpinski are part of a hierarchy, with a leader named Falk at the top. Falk units are described as a nearly godlike being, with the ability to bend the will of weaker minds and fathom their intentions and emotions. Below the Falk unit is Adler, an administration unit that acts as their secretary and helps them carry out tasks. There are a couple of unique replicas, but of note is the Colibri, a unit designed to read the minds of humans and replicas, who are frequently used to ensure no one is going against the Yusan regime. Each replica unit is identical, and based on the neural pattern of a previous human, although those records are either classified or missing. At some point during the mining operation on Sierpinski, the workers discovered something strange deep within the rock. Due to its unusual nature, the Falk unit decides to investigate alone. She never told anyone what she saw, but when she returned, she became sick, and that sickness spread through the facility. Humans who fell ill died almost immediately, whereas the stronger replicas would continue to corrupt until they became the monsters they are now. For most of the game, this is the central mystery. What did Falk see? And how did it cause a sickness like this to spread? Our one clue comes in a diary entry where she mentions the red eye and a white-haired girl. After finding her way through the mines, Elster discovers what Falk saw. A gate, much like the one from the opening. When she enters, she finds herself in a red desert, and eventually comes across the Penrose once again. Still not quite sure what is spurring her on, she attempts to open a hatch and gain access, destroying her arm in the process and falling. After the false ending, Elster once again wakes up in a pod on the Penrose. This time though, the cockpit shows that the ship is still in transit. After some investigating, we finally meet Ariane Young, the single human occupant of the Penrose. They embrace, and kiss, and dance, and spend lonely nights drifting through space, on a course to some unknown system in hopes of finding a habitable planet. This memory, from a completely different time, long before the events of the game actually take place, can't possibly be happening now. Elster reawakens, with one arm missing and her chest ripped open. She drags her way through the Penrose to the cryogenic freezer and finds the carcass of a previous Elster unit. She scavenges the body for parts and continues on her journey, now seemingly aware of the promise she has to keep. This scene is the game's smoking gun, not the miners digging up some ancient artifact, or Falk bringing the sickness back, or even the Yusan government developing replica technology. This journey on the Penrose was the beginning of it all. From the moment you hit play, Signalis makes its influences very apparent. Survival horror is one of those genres with two defining behemoths. so it's almost impossible to play one without seeing some essence of them within it. However, I do think Signalis takes the mantle of having the most homages I've ever caught in a single game. I'm not just talking about Resident Evil and Silent Hill either. There's tons of references to other media sprinkled throughout the game's runtime. About halfway through, when kanji started flashing on the screen, and a scene replicated a moment from Neon Genesis Evangelion almost one-to-one, I found myself asking a question. Is there such a thing as too many homages? Firstly, before we get into this question, I want to make it clear that I don't think Signalis is hacky or anything, and I think that's where my surprise comes from. Every 15 minutes it felt like I was going, oh, this gameplay moment is from X game, or oh, that scene looks identical to a scene from X anime. And normally, I would find that massively frustrating. I love an occasional reference or cheeky nod, but when something feels like it's just running through a checklist of references, I often find it fairly cheap. So why doesn't Signalis feel that way? To answer that, let's go through some of the game's most obvious influences. Firstly, we have to say the line. This game is inspired by Silent Hill and Resident Evil. Usually when we say this, we're talking about things like setting or controls and camera angles, but Signalis actually takes some more subtle cues. For Resident Evil, we've got the 6-item inventory, which is reminiscent of Chris from the first game. There are 2 types of survival horror inventories, and they basically differ with how many items you can carry. In Resident Evil, it's less about running out of items and ammo, but more about your inability to carry them. By the end of the game, your item box is full of equipment, but you can still only carry 6, and that's when you have to make tough decisions. This is why the item box exists, and it puts you in very specific situations. For example, while in most games you would prefer to have as much ammo on you as possible, if you're playing as Chris, you're more than likely going to load your shotgun and leave the rest of the bullets in the box. Carrying a weapon and ammo takes up about 1/3 of your entire inventory, and that's before you factor in herbs and key items. Signalis very much follows this school of philosophy, and in fact, actually makes it significantly harder. See, this game takes inspiration from Resident Evil Remake, and Chris technically has more than 6 slots in that game. One of these extra slots is taken up by his lighter. The lighter is used in a few parts of the game, but it means you never have to account for having it. It's just always there. In Signalis though, Elster's key items don't have that luxury, so when you get the flashlight at the midway point, anytime you have to visit a dark area, you're essentially left with 5 spare slots, before you even consider weapons, healing, or key items. To go one step further, the defensive items in Resident Evil Remake, such as the knife and grenades, exist in their own mini inventory, meaning they don't take up one of your 6 slots. Signalis says, nope. If you want to carry the self-revive or stun batons, you better be willing to give up one of your 6 slots for it. This game is one of the few examples of a horror game following the Resident Evil inventory system and making it even more strict, rather than making it easier. Then you've got the reviving enemies, and flares that we mentioned earlier, which is identical to the Crimson Head mechanic from Remake. For the most part, the Resident Evil references are restricted to gameplay mechanics, and I'm fine with that. The Crimson Heads are such a cool idea that a lot more games could, and probably should, use. Now, let's get on to Silent Hill, and I would argue this is where most of the homages lie. Let's get the obvious ones out of the way. The save location being a red square that fills your whole screen is a clear reference to Silent Hill 2. The general movement of the enemies as they stumble and flail wildly, along with some designs that feel pretty reminiscent of creatures from Silent Hill. The game beginning with your character looking into a mirror and carrying a photograph of a woman that they're looking for is very Silent Hill 2. Elster's tendency to jump down massive holes without fear also draws parallels to James Sunderland. Issa Ito's arc is almost identical to Lisa from the first Silent Hill, even meeting a similar fate after realizing the truth of their existence. All of these are very surface level comparisons or nods, but there's one in particular that I'll admit feels a little too on the nose. About 50% of the way through the game, Elster finds her way into the mines, and after jumping down yet another hole, she finds herself at a completely new area. For the first time since the game began, her map is empty, and the area doesn't seem like it belongs here. The walls are pulsing red, the floors are rusty metal, and the doors don't seem to make sense. The general aesthetic of this area already feels very Silent Hill, and I was okay with that. Silent Hill doesn't own rusty metal and the color red, but then I noticed the door tricks and lack of a map and realized it was a send up to nowhere, the last area of the original Silent Hill that also attempts to disorientate the player with strange doors and no map. Even then, I wasn't too bothered by it. It felt like a nice nod. Then I saved, only to see that the area was also called Nowhere, which felt like a step too far. Am I crazy for that? I'm not going to pretend that it harmed my enjoyment of the game in any way, but it did feel a little bit cheap. This was the moment I started formulating the question about homages in my head, because at what point does something turn from an homage into just feeling lazy? If it had been named something else, would I have minded as much? I don't know. But what I do know is that from this moment on, the references continue to fly. A cutscene plays and you've got an Evangelion reference, followed by a Ghost in the Shell reference, followed by a Lovecraft quote, and then back to more Silent Hill references. So I ask the question both to myself and to you. Is there such a thing as too many references? I will be the first to admit that not everyone is going to catch all of these references. While I'm not a unique person by any means, the Venn diagram of survival horror, old anime, and Lovecraft, while not being particularly thin, isn't exactly a circle. I think this was the first time I ever found myself catching 90% of the references a piece of media was making. Did it cheapen my experience? Surprisingly, no. But why? When the evil within referenced the first zombie from Resident Evil, I was rolling my eyes, and that was made by the same guy. Is it really just a case of, well, it's good, so it's okay? I don't know. I really don't have an answer for this question, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it if you have any, so please leave them down in the comments below. I want to start a discussion on this topic. Once Elster arrives in Rotfront, we finally begin to learn more about Ariana Young. Up until this point, we knew that she lived on a remote radio outpost with her mother, and was a trained radio specialist. A letter from her aunt to Ariana's mother in one of the flashbacks tells us that she eventually left the outpost to go to school in Rotfront. We now learn the results of that decision. In an earlier flashback while playing as Issa, we see a girl with white hair being bullied by faceless students. They push her to the ground and begin kicking her, before it cuts to a close-up shot of Ariana. In a report found late into the game, one of her teachers describes her as remarkably odd and expresses disgust at her obsession with paintings, music, and other such nonsense. The teacher ends with the note, "I can only hope military service will beat those frivolous ideas out of her in a way that the school has failed to do so far." The teacher also speaks of the Ito sisters, Issa and Erika, with similar disdain, as their family bookstore reportedly sells contraband books. In another note, a spy for the Empire writes that the white-haired girl who works in the photo store may be bioresonant, a term that has come up multiple times throughout the game. While not fully explained, bioresonance is a peculiar ability that seems to allow a person to connect to something far beyond them. It's also the same ability that allows Falk to control people and manipulate objects with her mind. We'll come back to this soon enough. Not feeling like she truly belonged, Ariane would eventually sign up for military duty on the Penrose program, after finding a photograph of a woman in military uniform who looked just like her, a woman named Alina So. She would eventually be accepted and placed on the Penrose with a lone Elster unit. At first, this was ideal for Ariane. She much preferred her isolated life on the outpost to the fakeness of the big city, and felt that this could be her chance to focus on her painting and live in isolation. As time went on, however, she found herself missing company, and began to spend more time with her Elster unit. During the dancing flashback, Ariane says that they're celebrating their 3000 cycle on the Penrose, so by that point, the two are intimately familiar with each other. That flashback also gives us one of the most tragic notes in the game, an unopened document about the Elster units and their known issues. They were selected for the Penrose mission due to their reliability under long-term isolation conditions, and it states that their original neural pattern is based on a soldier of Venedan origin. As a side note, we're never outright told who the original neural patterns for the replicas were. However, I believe the answer for Elster is hidden in Rotfront. In the photograph of Alina, we see a second girl standing next to her, with a very similar hairstyle to Elster. Alongside the photographs is a list of names, and one in particular stands out. Lilith Ito, presumably a relative of the Ito sisters. This isn't 100% guaranteed to be Elster's original Gestalt, however it does fit the few details we have about her. Back to the note, it ends with a clear message. To avoid resurfacing of Gestalt memories, do not show or give the Elster unit photographs, especially of soldiers during the war. Do not show the Elster unit movies or let it listen to music. Do not try to befriend the Elster unit. Whether Ariane would have heeded this warning had she read it is unknown. Regardless, with no one else but them on the ship, they inevitably became very close. But this couldn't be the Elster we're playing as the Penrose must have crashed a long time ago. Well, technically it is the same Elster, at least the same personality. A note around the midway point of the game explains that while the original Elster unit was based on a soldier, the neural pattern was lost, and in order to continue production, all future units were based on the neural pattern of a recovered Elster unit from a failed Penrose mission, a neural pattern that was already corrupted by her time with Ariane. This explains why her memories seem so vivid, yet she can't possibly exist at the same time as Ariane. The driving force for her isn't from her lifetime, it's an ancient goal to fulfill, to remember the promise a previous version of her made long ago. But what about the mysterious Alina So? If the photo Ariane finds is of the same girl, how can she exist after Ariane's death? In the final room of the game, we receive what I consider to be an answer. Had Ariane not been accepted for the Penrose program, she would have been placed in the mines instead, the same mines where Alina's diary is found. But Alina isn't real. She's an extension of Ariane's memories and subconscious, an alternate version of her based on a girl she saw in a photograph. What would have happened had she not been accepted for the Penrose mission? Maybe she would have had her own Elster unit in the mines. Her friends Issa and Erica may have been there, despite them being dead already. No one you run into seems to recognize the picture of Alina, and when Adler recognizes Elster, it's only because he's lived through this cycle of events before. Unfortunately for Ariane, even her alternative memories are being corrupted, turned over and repeated, becoming more unrecognizable each time. Neither Ariane or Alina can escape. As Elster's journey begins to come to an end, she finally confronts Falk, the unit who first discovered the Penrose through the gate in the mine. She speaks of herself as one half of a whole, with Elster being her other half, and tells her that she'll never dance with us again. Seemingly having been corrupted due to contact with Ariane's bioresonance, Falk is eventually killed, and Elster can confront her past. Now on the Penrose once more, we see the end of their mission. After 3,000 cycles, they failed to find any habitable planet. Whether Ariane knew it or not, the mission was a one-way trip, and supplies are dwindling. Her final transmission from her superiors is harrowing, full of jingoistic rhetoric and callousness. If you have not found a suitable world for landing by this point, accept that you will not. Find solace in the thought that others might be successful where you failed. We recommend you do not attempt to prolong your suffering by reusing old filters or rationing supplies. Instead, make peace with your fate. Remember, you will die having served your nation, by partaking in a glorious demonstration of our power. The transmission advises the pilot to ask their Elster unit to save them a slow, agonizing death. After at least 2,000 more cycles, with the ship now in ruin and the two falling apart, Ariane is placed in the cryogenic pod, and Elster perishes, unable to fulfill her promise. Now, an unknown amount of time later, flooded with memories of a life she didn't lead, our Elster unit must fulfill the promise that she made. The tragedy of Signalis is that every character, whether they be human or replica, was destined to meet a tragic end. Ariane was an outcast in a world that despised her, and in order to escape, voluntarily placed herself on a doomed mission that she would never return from. The Elster units that would later be based on the Penrose Elster carried her personality and memories, the horrors of watching the one person they love slowly decay, and being unable to put them out of their misery. Even Falk and Adler were developed for a specific purpose. They're not villains controlling the facility for their own gain. They were made to do it, and when they lost their purpose, they became corrupted. The only human character we meet throughout the game, Issa Ito, shared a similar fate to Ariane. The Ito bookstore sold contraband books, shared a love of art, and were shunned by their peers. While we don't know exactly how they die, we know that by the time we meet Issa in the mines, she's already long dead, her goal to find her sister being an impossible one. The common villain in all of this is the Yusan regime, the ones who promoted the torture and murder of supposed criminals, the ones who confiscate personal goods, suppress speech, and ban art, the ones who sent Ariane on a doomed mission knowing she most likely wouldn't return. Because she was different, Ariane was deemed expendable, whether it be floating through space or Deep Below the Rock in Sierpinski. This feeling of being abandoned and left for dead ultimately gives power to her bioresonance, which connected her to something even greater. Multiple notes in the game reference something called the Red Eye, but most seem to regard it as a folktale, an illusion that the people of Rotfront revered as a sort of god. While it's hard to tell what parts of Signalis are real and what parts are just taken from memories, the Red Eye does appear in one of the endings. A banned book found in the Ito bookstore explains that some individuals can not only perceive the connection that exists between all people, but actually manipulate and use it to shape the world around them. While not explicitly stated, this is most likely referring to bioresonance, as it also says that this is the power responsible for creating the replicas. We know that Falk coming into contact with the Red Eye is what started the sickness and invaded her memories, but there are two distinct possibilities here. One is that the Red Eye represents a godlike being, a representation of the cosmos that Ariane and other bioresonant people can connect with. The second is that when Ariane's bioresonance became too powerful, it began to corrupt and change the world around her, and due to her memories and time on Rotfront, took on a form that made sense to her, the Red Eye. Regardless, when Falk comes into contact with it through the gate, she assimilates Ariane and Elster. It feels like my mind has been contaminated, defiled, by another person's memory. I'm no longer fully myself anymore, but I've not fully become someone else either. I'm stuck here, between her and me, with half-formed dreams and recollections penetrating my brain and tainting my every action. We had made a promise. As the memories of a stranger rushed into my mind, I felt the borders of myself blur. Now I can no longer tell where Falk ends and Elster begins. But even when Elster finally sees Ariane again and fulfills her promise, there is no reprieve. As Adler implies at multiple points throughout the game, this has happened before and will continue to happen. Each time the world becomes slightly worse, decaying even further. By the time we see through the gate, the world already can't take much more. The multiple Elster corpses littering the Red Desert and inside the Penrose could very well be previous attempts. Even more despair-inducing, the Elster that you scavenge body parts from after the false ending is lying in exactly the same position as she dies in the promise ending, implying that even fulfilling her promise might not be enough. The world is already dying, and nothing can stop the cycle from repeating. In 1895, Robert W. Chambers' The King in Yellow was first published. The book is a collection of 10 short stories, although the first 4 are of particular interest. The stories are all unrelated, however they are loosely connected by a play which the book takes its title from. In the universe of the book, The King in Yellow is a 2-act play that we really don't know a lot about. Despite the 4 protagonists having read it, we're only offered glimpses into its content from bizarre, rambling descriptions and the occasional dialogue that breaks up different parts of the book. What we know for certain is that the first act of the play is rather mundane. However, if somebody was to read through to the second act, they'd be driven mad by it. I pray God will curse the writer, as the writer has cursed this world with this beautiful, stupendous creation, terrible in its simplicity, irresistible in its truth. A world which now trembles before the King in Yellow. It's a fantastic book, written years before Lovecraft would eventually create his mythos, and is a classic of weird supernatural fiction. When I first saw The King in Yellow in Signalis, I wondered what kind of purpose it served. I glossed over this when discussing homages and references earlier, but there are a few literary works referenced throughout the game, all credited of course. While Lovecraft's The Festival and Ambrose Bierce's An Inhabitant of Carcosa appear frequently, The King in Yellow serves a very different purpose. In the short stories, the play is described as being banned and confiscated across the world, yet it continues to spread like a disease. While nothing is openly wrong with the contents of the story, governments of the world feared it, and sought to keep it from the public's hands. Most of the protagonists in the short stories come across the book by chance, or find it having somehow appeared in their home. In Signalis, when Ariane sees the book in the window of the Ito bookstore, she returns later to buy it, only for Issa to tell her it was confiscated, and that no one was allowed to read it. When I first played through the game, I thought that The King in Yellow was less important because of its seemingly magic properties, and more because of its symbol as a banned book. Remember, Yusan is a totalitarian regime that suppresses language and art, so it would make sense as a symbol of Ariane's feelings towards the state that destroyed her life. But then, people found the secret ending. I'm not going to get into a full description here of how people discovered the final ending, titled Artifact. It involved spectrograms and a lot of hunting, but what you need to know is that if you tune your radio to a specific frequency in 3 different rooms, you can find 3 keys that unlock a safe in the office. The keys are named Eternity, Love, and Sacrifice, and all clearly relate to Elster and Ariane. Once you unlock the safe, you input a long code that the announcer gives you right at the beginning of the game, and only then do you unlock the ending. Much like the process for unlocking it, this ending is almost incomprehensible. Inside the safe is a white lily, the only object in the game that uses blue text instead of the standard red. Rather than confronting Falk, the game immediately ends with a scene of Elster placing the lily on a pedestal, and then falling to the ground. The camera pans up to reveal multiple other pedestals, all empty, with other Elster units lying at the bottom of them. In the middle of the hexagon lies a rectangular shape, similar to the cryogenic pod that Ariane was left in. However, much like the rest of the room, it appears to be made of flesh. In the middle of the pod lies a strange luminescent shape. The camera leaves the Penrose to show a red eye in the sky looking down on it, before finally cutting to the final scene, Elster and Ariane dancing in a disheveled version of the Penrose. The second story in Chambers' book is titled The Mask. It follows the life of Alec and his relationship with a couple named Boris and Genevieve. Alec was a painter, and worked alongside the sculptor Boris and another man named Jack Scott for many years. He was in love with Genevieve, however she had chosen Boris over him just the year prior. Still, he was happy for the both of them and had a deep admiration for them. As the story begins, Boris is showing Alec a miraculous liquid that he recently discovered, that allows him to turn any living thing into marble. It doesn't just encase it though, it clearly has a magical property, and is made from a previously undiscovered element. As a demonstration, Boris places a white lily into the mixture, and Alec watches as it's transformed into marble. When he holds it in his hand, Alec notes that the veins of the plant have been immaculately preserved. Boris shows Alec another example from a day previous, a goldfish, now suspended in marble, with a faint rosy light at its center. Throughout the story, both Boris and Alec refer to the process in different ways. At first, Alec says that Boris has destroyed the lily, and Boris seems offended by the word. Minutes later, Boris explains that he won't share the secret of the liquid with anybody, seemingly afraid of his own creation. Later in the story, Genevieve falls ill from some mysterious ailment, and both Boris and Alec are distraught. When Boris next speaks of the liquid, he refers to it as my rose-colored bath full of death. When Alec asks, is it death? Boris only responds, you are not prepared to call it life. Boris now attempts to increase the size of his tests by dropping a white rabbit into the mixture, and it turns to marble just like the rest of them. Unable to watch the experiment, Alec leaves the room and finds himself reading a copy of The King in Yellow. After the experiment, Genevieve begins crying for help, and both Boris and Alec run to her side. The two men find her incomprehensibly babbling, and when Alec touches her, she begins to confess her true feelings for him, and not Boris. From here, Alec too falls sick, and begins seeing visions of his friend Boris visiting him late at night. When he eventually recovers, he asks Jack to bring him to see Boris and Genevieve, only to discover that, in his absence, the two have been found dead. On the night of her confession, Genevieve had thrown herself into the bathtub full of the liquid, and grief-stricken by what he saw, Boris shot himself through the heart. Both Alec and Jack are left Boris's various things, and the house is left in Alex's care, with the statue of Genevieve lying before the Madonna in the marble room. After locking up the house and leaving Paris for a long time, Alec and Jack continue to remain in touch, traveling the world and exchanging letters, until one day Alec receives a letter from Jack that claims that he can't stop dreaming about Alec and Boris, and asks him to meet him in Paris. Upon returning, Alec finally resolves to stay in the house where Genevieve lies. However, he still refuses to visit the marble room. Now 2 years have passed since she first fell ill, and in reminiscing on the night he saw her last, Alec finally builds the courage to visit her. When he sees her, he recognizes the same pale azure veins that he saw in the lily and the goldfish, along with the faint rosy light in her chest. A servant brings him a letter, and he leaves the room to read it, although she starts to tell him some strange occurrences. A white rabbit had been found wandering the house. 2 goldfish were found flopping on the dining room floor. What's more, the marble rabbit and marble goldfish have seemingly been stolen. He waves her off, saying that it's probably a prank and that he'll look into it further, only to return to his study and find the marble lily. However, when he approaches it, he realizes that the lily is very much alive. Then, suddenly I comprehended, and sprang through the hallway to the marble room. The doors flew open, the sunlight streamed into my face, and through it, in a heavenly glory, the Madonna smiled, as Genevieve lifted her flushed face from her marble couch and opened her sleepy eyes. It's clear by now that the King in Yellow is key to understanding the story of Signalis, and the image of a lily is clearly extremely important. In The Mask, the lily is both the first thing we see turned to marble, and also the item that tips Alec off to what has happened. Before the surprisingly happy ending when Genevieve returns, the characters believe that the liquid discovered by Boris is irreversible, and that it represents death and destruction for the object. Alec even refers to the way the liquid attacks the subject during the transformation. But by the end, we discover that it's simply a matter of time before the marble dissipates, leaving the animal or person as they were the moment they were submerged in the liquid. The marble doesn't destroy, it preserves. This brings us back to Signalis, a story which, unfortunately, doesn't have the same happy ending as The Mask. When the Penrose was doomed after spending thousands of cycles slowly decaying, Elster fell apart, unable to fulfill her promise to Ariane. When this happens, Ariane instead puts herself in the cryogenic pod, preserving herself in the Penrose forever. Unlike The Mask, this preservation doesn't naturally run out, and no one is there even if she was to wake up. Once Elster leaves the lily on the pedestal, we see the scene of her and Ariane dancing on the ship. Despite what Falk says, it seems that the two do finally reunite and dance with each other again. But is it really as it seems? I believe that Signalis offers an inverse ending to The Mask, where instead of Ariane waking up like Genevieve, Elster joins her in whatever form she remains in. Whether this allows Elster to escape the cycle is unknown. It's clear from the ritual site that multiple Elsters have failed previously, but hers is the only pedestal with a lily. Is this a happy ending? Is this what Elster and Ariane really want? Are you still looking for answers where there are only questions? There's nothing but heartbreak at the end. I'm not going to claim that this is the definitive story of Signalis. In fact, there are tons of things that I'm still unsure on, and I wouldn't be surprised if a few of my interpretations aren't accurate. It's impossible to determine how much of the story is real and how much of it is fabricated. How exactly does the time loop work? Is the Red Eye a real cosmic being? Signalis is a complex puzzle box that's full of unreliable narrators, purposely obtuse plot, and shifting details. It's beautiful and gory, often both at the same time, but at its core, it's a story about 2 people whose lives were predestined to end tragically. I said at the beginning of this video that Signalis belongs with the best in its genre, and I truly believe that. While it's not without its flaws, neither are a lot of the games it takes inspiration from, and any amount of minor flaws don't come close to the gut punch that is the game's final act. I haven't stopped thinking about Signalis since I beat it, and I have a feeling I'll be thinking about it for a very long time. Thanks for watching. This video has been incredibly tough to make, hence why my upload schedule took a bit of a hit. I've really enjoyed reading and thinking about Signalis, and it's 100% a contender for my game of the year. If you've made it this far, then I cannot thank you enough for sticking through it. If you want to check out my socials or coffee, they're all in the description, and if you want to see longer videos like this from me in the future, then let me know. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you again real soon.